Well, I'm back again. Dave Walker, your Intisolve Connect guru here with some thoughts about keeping you in control of what is communicated in your online meetings. Have you ever been in an event where there was a heckler in the crowd? If so, you know that the heckler doesn't have to be saying anything that makes sense to disrupt the show. You may have had the same experience in an online meeting where chatting is allowed. On some occasions, you may have a controlled group and want the participants to have the freedom to express themselves in the chat pod. But sometimes in an event that's open to the public, you don't have much control over who attends, and it's easy for a competitor or a detractor of some kind to make negative comments about your company or your product. Now, you don't want to completely disable the chat because you need the attendees to be able to ask questions. So how can you get the one without risking the other? Connect Pro comes to the rescue with a chat pod and the Q&A pod. The functionality of the chat pod is pretty straightforward. It allows your participants to send messages to the hosts, presenters, and one another. There's a drop-down menu at the bottom of the chat pod that they can use to choose the recipient of the message. Sending a message to everyone causes the message to be displayed in black text. Sending a message to presenters causes the message to be displayed in green text, and it will only be visible to hosts and presenters. Participants can also choose to send a message to a specific individual by selecting that person's name. In this case, the message displays in red text and is only visible to the two people involved in that thread. Of course, the chat pod is flexible enough to allow you to disable private chat if you prefer not to allow it. To show you the Q&A pod, I'll have to open the presenter-only area. This is an area in your meeting room that only hosts and presenters can see. The Q&A pod is located right here at the bottom of the presenter-only area. When the Q&A pod is linked to a chat pod, participants can no longer use the chat pod to chat with one another. The linked chat pod becomes a pod for participants to use to ask questions of the presenters and hosts. I have another instance of this meeting room open where I'm logged in as a participant. I'll bring that up so you can see that the chat pod no longer allows participants to do anything in the chat pod but submit questions. When a question is submitted in the chat pod, only the submitter sees it in the chat pod. No one else in the room will see it. However, the host and presenters see the question displayed in the Q&A pod. Now the presenters can decide whether they'll respond to that question or not. Sometimes when you have a large webinar with several subject matter experts presenting in sequence, you may elect to appoint a gatekeeper for the Q&A pod. This person can assign each question to the presenter who is most qualified to answer that question. The presenters who will be answering the question can set the Q&A pod to display only their questions by setting the filter in this drop-down menu. Now, I'll only see those questions that have been assigned to me. If I decide to answer the question, I just type in the answer in this field at the bottom of the pod and click the button to send the answer so that everyone in the room can see it, or click the button that sends the answer only to the submitter. If I send the answer to everyone, you can see that it displays both the question and the answer in the chat pod, so everyone can benefit from my explanation. So, no hecklers, no negative comments, just you and your positive presentation putting your organization in the best light possible. Thank you, Adobe Connect Pro.